A grieving man was burdened with a broken woman, a cruel jest in a town that knew no kindness, until he looked past her stillness and saw a spirit that soared, teaching him that love wasn't about what was lost, but what could be found in the most unexpected soul. The dust of Redemption Gulch swirled with a malicious glee that afternoon, coating the tongues of its inhabitants with grit and scorn as Jedediah Thorne's wagon creaked to a halt before the mercantile. Upon its rough-hewn bed lay Elara, still as a fallen doll, her eyes, wide and the color of a stormy sky, reflecting the leering faces that gathered. She was a ruin, they whispered, a woman whose legs had forgotten the earth, her body a testament to some unspoken, unspeakable tragedy. Thorne, a man whose laughter was as coarse as his beard, bellowed for Thomas Ashton. "Ashton! Got a gift for Y.A., widower. Something to warm your cold bed, though she won't be doing much dancing." A wave of cruel laughter rippled through the crowd. Elara felt the heat of it on her skin, a familiar burn. She didn't flinch, didn't cry, tears were a currency she had long since exhausted. Her paralysis was a cage, but her mind was a hawk, observing, cataloguing every sneer, every pitiless glance. Thomas emerged from the shadows of the smithy, his face etched with a sorrow so profound it seemed to have carved canyons into his youth. His wife, Martha, had been gone 2 years, and with her, the light of his world. He was a man of dust and silence, his heart a fallow field. He saw Elara, a drift of pale calico and tangled dark hair, her stillness an accusation against the vibrant, cruel life around her. Thorne's men, with callous indifference, began to lift her, their hands rough, their jests like stones. The town watched, a gallery of judgment, eager for the spectacle of one broken soul being yoked to another. This was their entertainment, a brief, sharp distraction from the gnawing emptiness of their own frontier lives. Elara closed her eyes, not in surrender, but in a silent, desperate prayer for oblivion, a wish to be nothing more than the dust beneath the wagon wheels, invisible, unburdened by a body that had betrayed her. The wind carried the scent of dry earth and something bitter, like spoiled hope, and the laughter, oh, the endless, echoing laughter that branded her not as a woman, but as a thing, a cruel punchline. Thomas Ashton watched, his grey eyes, usually lost in the haze of memory, sharpening with a cold, clear light. He saw not the broken thing Jedediah Thorne presented, but the tremor of a delicate hand clenched against the rough wood of the wagon, the tight line of a jaw that refused to slacken in despair. He saw the flicker of an unbroken spirit in those stormy eyes before they'd closed. Thorne swaggered closer, smelling of cheap whiskey and self-satisfaction. "Well, Ashton? Ain't she a prize? Keep her, lose her, I don't care." "She's off my hands," the crowd tittered, waiting for Thomas's reaction. Would he refuse? Would he add his own scorn? He was, after all, a man known for his quiet suffering, not for acts of charity or defiance. An image flashed through Thomas's mind, Martha, her smile like the prairie dawn. Martha, who had always championed the underdog, the stray colt, the bird with a broken wing. The pain of her absence was a constant ache, but with it came the echo of her strength, her unwavering compassion. He stepped forward, his boots stirring the dust that seemed to mock Elara's stillness. The crowd hushed, anticipating. Thomas looked at Thorne, then at Elara, her face pale, her breathing shallow. He felt a familiar hollowness, the fear of another fragile life entrusted to his keeping, another potential for loss. But beneath it, something else stirred, a weary anger, a quiet refusal to participate in this casual cruelty. He said nothing of her paralysis, nothing of the jest. He simply met Thorne's gaze, his own as unyielding as the granite hills beyond the town. "I'll take her," Thomas said, his voice raspy from disuse, yet carrying a weight that silenced the last of the snickers. He didn't offer payment in coin, for she was not chattel, but he paid in a different currency, a silent assumption of responsibility that stripped Thorne of his power. He reached into the wagon, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he prepared to lift Elara. He saw her eyes open, a spark of disbelief, perhaps even fear, within their depths. He didn't offer platitudes, just a quiet strength that promised, if not comfort, then at least an end to this public torment. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with the town shifting, uneasy curiosity. He had taken the bait, swallowed the joke whole, but somehow, in his quiet acceptance, he had turned the tables, casting the shame back onto the jesters. Thomas carried Ilara from the wagon as if she weighed nothing, his movements economical and devoid of any show. He felt the delicate bird-like bones beneath the thin fabric of her dress, the way her head lolled slightly against his shoulder, a fragile weight. He ignored the stares, the sudden silence of the crowd that was perhaps more unnerving than their earlier jeers. He placed her gently on the worn seat of his own buckboard, a vehicle more accustomed to hauling feed and tools than a human passenger. He didn't speak, not to her, not to anyone. He merely untied his horse, climbed onto the driver's seat, and with a soft click of the reins, urged the animal forward, leaving Redemption Gulch and its casual cruelties behind. The journey to his ranch was made in a silence broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the sigh of the wind through the tall prairie grass. Ilara remained still, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape, a blur of browns and golds under the vast, indifferent sky. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. What did this man want? What new torment awaited her in the isolation he was taking her to? Kindness from strangers was a language she had long forgotten, if she had ever known it. His ranch was a stark silhouette against the setting sun when they arrived, a small, weathered cabin and a barn that leaned precariously, like an old man tired of standing. It was a place that echoed his own grief, functional but unloved, the fences mended but the paint peeling, the small garden Martha had tended now overrun with weeds. He lifted her again, carried her inside the cabin. It was dim, smelling faintly of wood smoke, old sorrow, and disuse. There was one main room, a rough table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and a narrow cot in the corner. He laid her on the cot, her temporary resting place, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. Her eyes, wide and searching, held a lifetime of pain. His, shadowed and weary, offered no easy answers. He built a fire, the crackle and flare a small defiance against the encroaching darkness and the chill of the evening. He moved with a quiet efficiency, preparing a simple meal of beans and dried meat. He offered her a plate, his movements careful, expecting nothing. She ate slowly, every mouthful a conscious effort, acutely aware of his presence, of the unspoken tension that filled the small space. He didn't press her to speak, didn't ask questions. He simply existed in the same space, a quiet, brooding presence that was, in its own way, less terrifying than the boisterous cruelty of the town. He mended a broken latch on the single window, the small sound of his work a counterpoint to the wind howling outside, a sound that seemed to echo the desolation within them both. That night, sleep was a shallow, restless thing for Ilara, filled with the fear of the unknown, yet somewhere deep inside, a tiny, almost imperceptible seed of something other than despair began to stir. It was not hope, not yet, but a fragile curiosity. Days at the Ashton Ranch settled into a quiet rhythm, a slow dance of unspoken needs and hesitant gestures. Thomas rose before dawn, the sounds of his morning chores, the pump handle's groan, the soft nickering of his horse, the chop of an axe, becoming the soundtrack to Ilara's waking hours. He would leave a tray of food by her cot, simple fare, but always there. He had fashioned a wider doorway to the cabin and smoothed the threshold, small, practical acts of consideration that spoke louder than any words. Ilara, initially paralyzed by more than just her limbs, began to observe the small world of the cabin with an intense focus. She watched Thomas as he moved, his large hand surprisingly deft as he repaired a worn leather strap or sharpened a tool. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in short, gruff sentences, mostly to his horse or to himself. Yet, she saw the way his shoulders sagged when he thought himself unobserved, the deep lines of grief etched around his mouth that softened only when he was engrossed in a task. She yearned to contribute, to shed the suffocating cloak of uselessness that had been draped over her for so long. Her hands, at least, were her own. She began by tidying the small space around her cot, folding the thin blanket with meticulous care. One afternoon, finding a basket of mending Thomas had neglected, a shirt with a torn sleeve, trousers with a gaping knee, she hesitantly picked up a needle and thread he'd left on a small crate. Her fingers, stiff at first, slowly remembered the motions. When Thomas returned, he found her absorbed in her work, a small frown of concentration on her face. He stopped in the doorway, saying nothing, but she felt his gaze. A flush crept up her neck. He merely grunted, a sound that could have meant anything, and went about his evening routine. But the next day, a small, intricately carved wooden box appeared on the crate beside her cot, containing an assortment of needles, threads, and buttons. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. He had seen her effort, acknowledged it. Slowly, cautiously, a fragile tendril of trust began to uncurl within Ilara. She still feared the future, still carried the weight of her past, but the crushing immediacy of her despair began to recede, replaced by a tentative watchfulness. He had not hurt her, had not exploited her helplessness. He had offered her shelter, sustenance, and now, a silent acknowledgement of her desire to be more than a burden. She began to notice the small wildflowers he sometimes inadvertently brought in on his muddy boots, crushed but still holding a hint of color, and once, he left a single, perfect prairie rose in a tin cup where she could see it. These unspoken kindnesses were like water on parched earth, slowly seeping into the desolate landscape of her heart. One evening, as the fire cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls of the cabin, a comfortable silence settled between them, a silence no longer heavy with suspicion but filled with a quiet companionship. Thomas sat staring into the flames, a familiar sadness clouding his features. Ilara, mending one of his worn shirts, watched him, a needle pausing mid-stitch. The wind outside whined a mournful tune, a fitting accompaniment to the unspoken grief that hung in the air. Hesitantly, her voice soft and raspy from disuse, Ilara spoke. "You miss her very much." It wasn't a question, but a statement of quiet understanding. Thomas started, as if pulled from a deep dream. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight, and for the first time, she saw not just sorrow, but a raw, aching vulnerability. He nodded slowly. "Martha," he said, her name a soft breath. She was everything. The sun, the moon, the stars. "This ranch, it was our dream." He fell silent for a long moment, then continued, his voice low. "An illness took her. Swift and cruel. I couldn't stop it. Watched her fade, and there was nothing I could do." The guilt in his voice was a palpable thing, a heavy cloak he wore constantly. Ilara listened, her heart aching with a shared understanding of helplessness. She knew what it was to be powerless against the forces that shaped and shattered lives. Emboldened by his rare candor, she found her own voice, a thread connecting her past to this fragile present. "I wasn't always like this," she began, her gaze dropping to her still hands in her lap. "I loved to dance. To run through the fields. My father, he had a temper. One day, his anger, it was a storm. There was a fall." She didn't elaborate on the violence, the terror, the agonizing pain that followed, or the subsequent abandonment when she became a burden. The raw facts were enough. Her words hung in the air, a stark admission of her own brokenness, her own deep well of loss, not just of movement, but of family, of belonging, of a life stolen. Thomas looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing beyond the paralyzed limbs to the fierce spirit that had endured such cruelty. He saw the strength it took to speak of such pain, the resilience that had kept her from shattering completely. "You are not broken, Ilara," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "You are strong. Stronger than anyone I know." Her breath caught. No one had ever called her strong. Burden, cripple, jest, those were the labels she knew. The fire crackled, a small, warm sound in the vast silence of the prairie. In that shared moment of vulnerability, the walls between them, built of grief and mistrust, began to crumble, revealing the tender shoots of a connection neither had expected, a bond forged in the crucible of shared sorrow and unspoken understanding. He hadn't just given her shelter, he was, in his own quiet way, giving her back pieces of herself she thought were lost forever. The late autumn sky, bruised purple and grey, had been threatening for days. A bitter wind whipped around the small cabin, rattling the window panes and seeping through the cracks in the walls, carrying the scent of snow. Thomas had been out since dawn, trying to secure the last of the livestock and reinforce the aging barn against the coming onslaught. Ilara watched from her cot, a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. She had an uncanny sense for the weather, a deep, primal intuition that often proved more accurate than any barometer. This storm, she felt, would be a bad one, a true prairie blizzard that could trap them, test them to their limits. As dusk began to bleed into the landscape, Thomas stumbled back into the cabin, his face pale and drawn, a dark stain spreading across his trouser leg. He'd been trying to secure a loose beam in the barn when it had shifted, a heavy piece of timber glancing off his thigh before crashing to the ground. He sank onto a chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Just a bad bruise," he muttered, but the way he cradled his leg, the sheen of sweat on his forehead, told Ilara otherwise. Fear, sharp and cold, pierced through her. He was injured, perhaps seriously, and they were alone, with a monster of a storm bearing down on them. Panic threatened to engulf her, but then she saw the look in his eyes, not just pain, but a fierce concern for her. He was worried about how she would fare if he was incapacitated. That look, that selfless worry, doused her panic with a surge of resolve. She could not walk, she could not physically tend to his wound in the way Martha might have, but she was not helpless. Her mind was sharp, her senses acute. "Thomas," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "you need to show me." "Tell me what to do." He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his pain-filled eyes. He'd grown accustomed to her quiet presence, her mending, but this was different. This was a demand for agency. Slowly, gritting his teeth against the pain, he guided her. He needed the wound cleaned, bandaged tightly. He directed her to the small box of medical supplies Martha had kept, carbolic, clean linen. With movements made clumsy by her position but guided by a desperate precision, Ilara managed. She tore strips of linen with her teeth and hands, her fingers surprisingly nimble as she followed his pained instructions to clean and bind the gash, which was deeper than he'd let on. The storm hit then, a howling fury of wind and snow that obliterated the world outside. The temperature in the cabin plummeted. Thomas, weakened by blood loss and the throbbing pain in his leg, began to shiver violently, his teeth chattering. A fever was taking hold. Ilara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that if his fever rose unchecked, he might not survive the night. She had seen it before. "More blankets," she urged, her voice low and intense. "And the fire, Thomas, we need more wood on the fire." He was already drifting, his responses sluggish. She spoke to him constantly, her voice a lifeline in the growing storm of his delirium, urging him to stay awake, to fight. She remembered her grandmother, a woman wise in the ways of herbs, speaking of willow bark tea for fevers. There was no willow bark here, but perhaps she scanned the meager supplies. There was little, but her mind raced, piecing together fragments of old knowledge, a desperate ingenuity born of necessity. She had him drink water, spoonful by spoonful, and talked through the long, terrifying night, her voice a fragile shield against the howling wind and the encroaching shadow of death. She could not physically protect him, but she could be his anchor, his will to live, her quiet strength a beacon in the storm. The blizzard raged for 2 days and nights, an unrelenting white fury that imprisoned them in the small cabin. Thomas's fever burned, his lucid moments becoming fewer and farther between. Ilara, her own body aching with the strain of her awkward ministrations and the constant tension, fought a desperate battle. She kept the fire fed, a monumental task from her cot, using a long stick Thomas had once used as a poker to nudge logs into place. She spooned broth, cooled with snow she painstakingly gathered from the window sill, between his cracked lips. She talked to him, not just to keep him anchored, but to keep herself from succumbing to the gnawing fear that threatened to devour her. She told him stories of her childhood before the fall, of dreams she once had, of the colors of the wildflowers in the meadows she could no longer run through. She spoke of the sea, a place she had only heard of but imagined vividly, its vastness a mirror to the prairie sky. Her voice, soft yet persistent, filled the small cabin, a counterpoint to the storm's relentless roar. In his delirium, Thomas sometimes murmured Martha's name, and a pang of something unnameable, a sorrow not entirely her own, would pierce Ilara. But she would gently correct him, "It's Ilara, Thomas. I'm here," and sometimes, a flicker of recognition would cross his face. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tide began to turn. On the third morning, the wind had died to a mournful sigh, and the world outside was a dazzling, silent expanse of white. Thomas's fever broke. He woke, weak and disoriented, to find Ilara watching him, her face pale and etched with exhaustion, but her stormy eyes clear and steady. He was alive. He knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that he owed his life to this still woman, this broken gift the town had mocked. Her resilience, her quiet, unwavering determination, had been the thread that pulled him back from the brink. The silence that followed was different now, imbued with a new depth of understanding, a shared experience of survival that transcended words. As Thomas slowly regained his strength over the following days, a new dynamic settled between them. He watched her with a new appreciation, a sense of wonder. She, who could not move, had moved heaven and earth for him. He saw not her limitations, but her boundless spirit. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the newly cleaned window, casting a warm glow on the cabin, Jedediah Thorne's hulking figure appeared in the doorway, blocking the light, his presence a dark stain on their fragile peace. He was flanked by two of his brutish companions, their expression smug and predatory. "Well, well," Thorne sneered, his eyes flicking from Thomas, still pale but recovering, to Elara on her cot. "Heard you had some trouble, Ashton. Thought I'd come check on my property. See if she's still worth anything, or if the winter's finished her off." Thorne's words, laced with their usual casual cruelty, struck Thomas like a physical blow. Property. The word was an obscenity, a brand Thorne sought to reimpose on Elara, negating everything they had weathered together. Thomas felt a cold rage rise within him, a protective instinct so fierce it momentarily eclipsed the lingering weakness from his fever and injury. He pushed himself straighter in his chair, his hand instinctively going to the heavy iron poker resting by the hearth, a relic from the storm that now felt like a potential weapon. He remembered the war, the sickening feel of violence, the hollowness that followed. He had sworn off it, retreated into his grief, into his silence. But this was different. This wasn't about an abstract enemy or a distant cause. This was about Elara, about the sanctuary they had inadvertently built, about the spark of life she had fanned back into existence within him. He saw the flicker of fear in Elara's eyes, quickly masked by her customary stoicism, and it solidified his resolve. Thorne took a step into the cabin, his gaze lingering on Elara with an unpleasant possessiveness. "Heard tell she might be some kind of healer woman now," Thorne said, a greasy smile spreading across his face. "Maybe she's got some value after all. Might be I want her back. A good luck charm, eh?" One of his men chuckled. Thomas rose slowly to his feet, his injured leg protesting, but he ignored the pain. He was no longer the grieving widower, lost in shadow. He was a man with something to defend, something precious and hard-won. "She's not property, Thorne," Thomas said, his voice quiet but carrying the resonant force of a striking bell. "And she's not yours," Thorne bristled, his bravado momentarily faltering at the unexpected steel in Thomas's tone. "Now see here, Ashton. She was given to you. A gift. Or did you forget that?" "I remember a cruel jest," Thomas replied, his eyes like chips of ice. "But Elara is a woman, not a trinket to be passed around. She stays here. This is her home." He took a deliberate step forward, positioning himself between Thorne and Elara. The small cabin seemed to shrink, charged with an explosive tension. Thorne, accustomed to bullying and bluster, was taken aback by Thomas's unwavering stance. He had expected the same broken man he'd mocked weeks ago. This Thomas was different, harder, infused with a purpose that made him dangerous. "You'd fight for her, widower?" Thorne sneered, trying to regain the upper hand. "For that cripple?" The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Before Thomas could answer, Elara spoke, her voice clear and surprisingly strong, cutting through the tension. "I am not a cripple, Mr. Thorne. I am Elara. And this is my home because I choose it to be. Mr. Ashton did not take me, he sheltered me." There is a difference. Her words, spoken with quiet dignity, landed with more force than any physical blow. Thorne stared at her, momentarily speechless. He had expected a cowering, silent victim, not this articulate defiance. He looked from Elara's resolute face to Thomas's unyielding stance and realized he had miscalculated. There was nothing more to be gained here, only the potential for a fight he might not easily win, and the public humiliation of being bested by the town's widower and the woman he'd discarded. With a snarl of frustration, Thorne backed away. "You'll regret this, Ashton," he spat, but his threat lacked conviction. He turned and stomped out, his men trailing behind him, their swagger deflated. The oppressive atmosphere lifted as their shadows retreated from the doorway, leaving behind a silence that hummed with victory and unspoken emotion. The confrontation with Thorn, though terrifying, had acted as a crucible, burning away the last vestiges of doubt and fear between Thomas and Ilara. In its aftermath, a profound sense of peace settled over the small cabin, a peace born of shared adversity and acknowledged commitment. Thomas turned to Ilara, his heart full. He saw not her paralysis, but the immense strength of her spirit, the unwavering light in her stormy eyes. He saw the woman who had saved him, body and soul. He walked over to her cot, the floorboards creaking softly beneath his worn boots. He knelt, an unconscious gesture of respect, of devotion. Words felt inadequate, clumsy tools to express the depth of his feelings. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a meadowlark, its wings poised as if about to take flight. He had worked on it in secret during the long nights of his recovery, pouring all his unspoken gratitude and burgeoning love into the smooth, warm wood. He placed it gently in her open palm. Her fingers closed around it, her touch sending a shiver through him. "I carved this for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's a meadowlark. They sing even when the storms gather. They choose their own sky." Ilara looked from the bird to his face, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She understood the symbolism. He wasn't keeping her, he was acknowledging her freedom, her spirit that soared despite its earthly tether. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's beautiful, you are beautiful, Ilara," he said, the words finally finding their way, simple and true. "This place, it was just a shell before you came. You breathed life back into it, back into me. This is your home, Ilara, not because you were given, but because you choose to be here. And I choose you. Every day, I will choose you." Her tears finally fell then, not tears of sorrow or shame, but tears of overwhelming joy, of a belonging she had never dared to dream of. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, yet electric. In that moment, all the pain, all the loneliness, all the cruelty they had endured seemed to fall away, leaving only the pure, undeniable truth of their connection. He had shown her what true love was, not a grand declaration, but a series of quiet actions, of steadfast protection, of seeing the true worth of a soul beyond its physical vessel. It was acceptance. It was choice. It was a shared song against the storm. The cabin, once a symbol of his grief, now felt like a haven, a testament to the resilience of the human heart and its infinite capacity for healing and love. A year later, the Ashton Ranch, now often referred to by the few passing travelers as Meadowlark Rise, was a transformed place. The leaning barn stood straight and true, mended with fresh timber. The cabin, though still humble, had a new coat of whitewash, and colorful wildflowers, planted by Thomas in raised beds Ilara could easily reach from a sturdy chair he had crafted for her, bloomed riotously by the porch. A smooth wooden ramp led to the doorway, a permanent testament to her place in this home. Inside, the cabin was filled with a quiet warmth. Ilara's intricate mending and stitching adorned small cushions and curtains, adding touches of beauty and comfort. Her laughter, a sound Thomas had once thought he'd never hear, now often mingled with his own softer chuckles. She had found her voice, not just in speaking her mind, but in song, her clear, sweet melodies drifting out over the prairie on summer evenings. Thomas was a changed man. The deep furrows of grief on his face had softened, replaced by lines of contentment. He still worked hard, but there was a lightness in his step, a purpose that went beyond mere survival. He had learned to live again, to love again, guided by Ilara's unwavering spirit. The community of Redemption Gulch, once so quick to judge and scorn, had slowly, grudgingly, begun to shift its perception. Word of Thomas's stand against Thorn had spread, as had tales of Ilara's quiet wisdom during the Great Blizzard. Some folks, facing their own troubles, had hesitantly sought her out, finding in her keen observations and compassionate listening a solace they hadn't expected. They saw Thomas's devotion, the way his eyes followed Ilara, the gentle care with which he assisted her. They saw not a burden, but a partnership, a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. They saw a woman who, despite her physical limitations, possessed an inner strength and grace that shamed their earlier cruelty. Jedediah Thorne kept his distance, his power in the town diminished by the quiet dignity of the couple he had tried to destroy. Elara was no longer the paralyzed woman, the broken gift. She was Elara of Meadowlark Rise, a woman of spirit and resilience, a testament to the fact that true worth lay not in what the body could do, but in what the heart could hold. Thomas and Elara had not just found love, they had created it, cultivated it in the harsh soil of their pasts, nurturing it with patience, kindness, and unwavering commitment. Their home was a sanctuary, not just for them, but for the very idea that even in the deepest despair, hope could take root and flourish, that even the most broken of wings could learn to catch the wind and soar. Their love was a quiet melody, a resilient wildflower, a beacon of light in a world too often shrouded in darkness. This story, of a struggling widower and the paralyzed woman he was given as a cruel jest, is a testament to the profound truth that love sees beyond the surface, beyond the physical, into the very heart of a soul. It reminds us that true strength is not the absence of wounds, but the courage to heal, to reach out, to find connection even in the face of immense adversity. Thomas did not fix Elara, nor did she fix him. Instead, they created a space where each could heal the other, where their perceived weaknesses became the foundation of an unbreakable bond. He saw her spirit, not her stillness; she saw his heart, not his sorrow. Together, they redefined what it meant to be whole, proving that true love isn't about finding a perfect person, but about seeing an imperfect person perfectly, and choosing to build a life alongside them, day by day, kindness by kindness. Their journey from public humiliation to private salvation is a powerful echo of the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of compassion. It teaches us that value is not dictated by societal labels or physical abilities, but by the courage, kindness, and love we offer to the world and to each other. If their story has touched your heart, if it has inspired you to look for the extraordinary in the seemingly ordinary, to seek connection over judgment, then please, take a moment to like this video, share it with others who might find solace or inspiration in its message, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that celebrate the enduring power of the human heart. Thank you for watching, and may you always find the strength to choose love in all its unexpected and beautiful forms.